If you look at the hotspots globally now, there are three main areas: Syria, North Korea in North Asia, and also in our regions, South China Sea. How do you view the problems in the Korean Peninsula developing, and also has it any linkages, anything to do with also the turmoil in the South China Sea?
Yeah, well, in East Asia, there are actually a number of hotspots. The Korean Peninsula, East China Sea between China and Japan, Taiwan, and then of course South China Sea. So there's this whole arc of hotspots, and the Korean Peninsula is linked to the South China Sea because both the U.S. and China are involved in all these hotspots. And so if any of these hotspots become unstable, inevitably it's going to draw in both the U.S. and China, and that will create what you might call horizontal escalation throughout this whole chain of hotspots. So it's very important to keep things calm, steady, dialogue. Don't do anything provocative. Being sort of risk-taking at this moment is not the wisest course, I think.
What kind of security framework that should be employed in resolving the conflict in the two hotspots that you have mentioned, Korean Peninsula and also South China Sea? Should it be limited, to the bilateral talks between China or the U.S., or can we rely on the other regional security arrangement or with the involvement, of the ASEAN and other key players like Japan or also South Korea?
Right. Many people say that if the U.S. and China can just get together in a G2, we can solve the world's problems, but I don't really think that's true. Just take the case of the Korean Peninsula and North Korea. China can't really control what the North does. The U.S. really can't control what its South Korean ally does. And in all these crisis areas, the countries directly involved need to have a say in how these problems are ultimately managed, if not resolved. So I would say a multilateral framework would be best. Obviously, there has to be quiet bilateral diplomacy going on at the same time, and not just between the U.S. and China. It could be between the U.S. and ASEAN, or between China and Japan. But I think ultimately the settlement has to be multilateral.
China is now floating the One Belt, One Road project in order to help finance the infrastructure developments in the 21st century, linking Asia, Europe, and Africa together. At the same time, President Obama has also been pushing for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, creating the free trade area among the Pacific Rim countries. In your opinions, how do these two projects compete against each other? Are both the U.S. and China trying to mobilize other countries, to serve their causes?
That's a great question, and I think on one level, these two initiatives are competing because the TPP takes forward another step, the traditional U.S. approach to trade liberalization based on multilateral, legally binding treaties with adjudication by independent third-party tribunals.
That's why it has been running, facing obstacles, from those workers or NGOs or other organizations.
Yes, because it's a very open and democratic process, and so at the beginning, it has to pass the legislatures of the countries, and so that's a very political process. But once it's passed, you have this framework for trade liberalization. China's approach is at a different level. It doesn't take this legal multilateral approach. It takes mostly a bilateral approach based on not trade liberalization but trade facilitation, which means building infrastructure, making it easier to do trade without changing the legal foundations of trade. And so, in a sense, what China is doing is at a different level from what the U.S. is doing. And One Belt, One Road really is the foundation, the most important part of Xi Jinping's China dream. That is, this is the dream to recover China's lost primacy in Asia by 2049, the 100th birthday of the PRC. And what's different is that, of course, not only are we in a new era, sort of a post-industrial era, but I think the scale of China's ambition is much larger than in the pre-modern era. We're not just talking about Asia, we're talking about Eurasia, including Europe and Africa. So the scale of ambition is really unprecedented and obviously attention-grabbing.
With the rivalry and also fierce competition between China and the U.S., in your opinion, what should be the position of the ASEAN countries? But the fact that ASEAN is a very diverse region with each country pursuing its own narrow national interests. So what should be the overall position of ASEAN regarding the superpowers rivalry?
Well, the symbol of ASEAN is a sort of a sheaf or 10 sort of pillars bound together. And, being bound together gives ASEAN strength and standing. If ASEAN doesn't stand together or find something to stand together on, there's no reason for it. So I think what ASEAN has to do is not necessarily take sides between the U.S. and China, but figure out what ASEAN's best interest is, and also not to be divided, not to allow these big powers to divide ASEAN and weaken it, because if ASEAN becomes dysfunctional in its core functions, which are security and stability in the region, if it becomes dysfunctional there, it's gone, and that would be a loss for the whole region, because ASEAN has been key to building institutions that hold this region together. If ASEAN is gone and all we're left with is great power competition, nothing good is going to come of that.
Thank you very much.